There's a lot of talk these days about having our boundaries, about disconnecting from toxic people. So, is it really okay to do that? Well, yes, but I do want to get into that a little further, a little deeper, and nuance it a little bit. Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. On this channel, I strive to give you all kinds of strategies and tips around attachment style healing and relationships and living your best life. And so, if you want a little more help and want some coaching, you can look below or you can get on my email list just to find out a little more content. So, today I want to talk about something, and perhaps it's extra pertinent because Thanksgiving's coming up in the United States. And so we tend to think of interactions with families, and some people even are thinking, like, are they even going or not, right? If they've had a toxic thing happening with their family. So that's probably why I was prompted to do this topic, but it really applies like all the time and in all kinds of ways, right? So, what about this whole thing about how we are using more boundaries, hopefully, and we sometimes do choose to whether it's not attending an event, or whether it's simply like a boundary in a conversation and disconnecting that way, or whether it's actually ending a relationship or taking a break from a relationship, whether it's a friendship or some other kind of relationship. Like, what about that whole thing about, like, is that kind, right? Is there something to that, like that it's like selfish to do that? Like, I think we're pretty much past thinking of it as selfish, and we think of it like, the more psychologically healthy we are, and that does involve boundaries and assessing our own needs and how things are affecting us, that spreads out into the world. So that's absolutely a fundamental truth. But I think it's okay to just talk about the nuances of it a little bit, because sometimes it can be more complicated, right? Like, there can even be sort of gray area cases where, what if we're like feeling okay sometimes, interacting with someone because we are in a really good place in our life, but they're kind of like being a little toxic in how they talk or something like that. Is that okay then to just, stay connected with that? So it really does get almost into like discernment and like listening to ourselves more and more, our own intuition and our own, understanding ourselves well too. So let me first though talk about why it's not really about kindness in my view, if we really see that something's affecting us such that we should disconnect. So let's just use an example of, let's say, a friend who is being somewhat toxic with us. Let's say they're criticizing us, or perhaps we've mentioned it a bit, and it just doesn't. Maybe we're kind of on different paths anyway, and we're thinking about taking a break or ending the friendship. So I would argue that it's not really in a more deep level kind to enable that person. So we of course cannot control at all when someone else's own insights or personal development journey come on. So we can't be doing it like for that, like, oh, well, hopefully they'll learn from this. I mean, it's not like that. However, I do think that enabling people does sort of lengthen their process. It does lengthen the time it takes for them perhaps to come to more growth or insights or personal development. And so, is it really deeply kind to just, sort of enable their behavior? I don't think so. So, turning it back to ourselves, how about our own personal development journey? So, boundaries and being able to understand how things are affecting us and taking action on that are really, really important to our own personal development journey. And you may know some about this already, but let me just say a couple of the reasons why. So, part of it is because we're, of course, influenced by others in society. So, there's this, we sort of have to know that there's this idea of what's nice and what's considered, the way you're supposed to behave and things like that. And we have to take into account that we're influenced by that and try to look deeper at what we really need and what we really want and what is really affecting us. So there's a little bit of, I guess, counteracting that going on. So the second piece is that if we're not being empowered, if we're not listening to ourselves, if we don't notice if that's not what we really want or need right now with this person, or if we're being affected by it, it could be that is our own patterns that we've been trying to potentially work on, like people pleasing, or like conflict avoidance that could be happening. So that's not really like challenging ourselves then, right? It's not challenging ourselves in our personal development journey if we just ignore it. And then a third point is that for our own personal development journey with regard to this disconnecting from someone, is that we don't learn to trust ourselves. So it's really important. A lot of the personal development journey and self-understanding and all that is trusting ourselves. And if we don't follow through on where we're having intuition or understanding that something isn't working for us, then it becomes hard to trust ourselves in all kinds of ways. So it can carry through even to other areas of life. And then fourthly, it's also true that it really does have to do with self-love. Like, if we're not taking ourselves into account fully, that is not showing ourselves self-love. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the other person and how it's not necessarily, really isn't kind to just let them have that behavior for their own journey. We've talked about our own journey and all these pieces of why this disconnect could be an important way to go. Just a really basic other point, it's not honest, right? It's not honest if we're not telling someone how something's affecting us, or if we're not listening to our own guidance. So there's that honesty factor, that there's some sort of masking or something else going on if we're not doing that. And then fourthly, I want to make this slightly more complicated point, that I believe that we're not also able to sort of more deeply or accurately, or I guess more deeply connect with our own, like what's going on for us as well. Like, if we don't do this kind of thing, if we're not able to be someone, especially if we make it on principle that we try to, be nice, and we don't even feel like we could ever disconnect from someone or ever do that kind of thing. Like, I feel like we're then unable to moment to moment really listen to ourselves, because when that's off the table, then it's kind of cutting off a whole range of things. And I think often how that works is, if we don't want to go down that path, then we don't even see the things leading up to it. So we can be blind to other things coming in for ourselves as well, around our own feelings, for example. So maybe we're suppressing feelings because of it. So I think having it on the table, even just more generally, that if something isn't working out for us, it is on the table, that we could disconnect, is super important. All right, with all that said, we can still be kind in how we do it, right? That can be part of our journey to try to, it's not going to always be perfect, right? If we're triggered in the moment, will we ever have a time when we say something not the way we would want to say it? Sure, it's going to happen. But ideally, we're talking about ideally here, right? Ideally, we would do it in a kind way. And I want to say that, like, clarity is part of that kindness, right? So honesty and clarity can be part of that kindness, because leaving, the more confused someone is, that's not really kind either. So kindness can be part of it still. And we can still also, still really wish them well. Like, on some level, we had this journey together, and now we're like, our paths are separating, but we can wish them well. We can pray for them if that's something you do. We can send them good intentions. And I would even argue that we can still feel connected to them. Like I said, we sort of have this history that we can think of that way. In the wider human sense, we can just think of it that way, that we're still, on some level, in a certain way, sort of still connected to them, even though we're not interacting anymore in talking or in seeing each other. All right, so now I want to bring some nuances to perhaps considerations for the decision about whether to disconnect or not. This doesn't mean you for sure wouldn't disconnect, but it's things that I think are important to take into account if we're really trying to go as deep with this as we can. So I think it's important to be very aware of our own state. So I've already been mentioning trying to be aware of if we're people pleasing, or conflict avoidant, in not doing the disconnect. But I think it's also important to notice if we are sort of reflexively making the decision to disconnect. So for some of us more often, and for some of us just occasionally, it could be that something's triggering us, and it even maybe isn't as much to do with the person. So understanding ourselves and our triggers is important there. Or maybe, what if it's that we could have a conversation with the person that would resolve it, and we haven't even done that. We just are conflict avoidant, so we want to avoid it entirely, and it feels easier to cut it off rather than have the conversation. So if you want to go really deep here, if you can try to notice your own triggering and what you're trying to potentially avoid, also thinking it from the angle of, like, am I cutting things off too soon? That's also important. So I'm just going to come back to the key points now from all of this, what I said, sort of bringing some things together. So, like I said, it's important not to act reflexively, whether that's reflexively just being nice and enabling, or whether that's reflexively doing a cutoff. It's also really important, though, to remember that having it on the table at all, just as I guess part of our own principle of life, that we could ever cut something off with someone is really important, because otherwise we really might have blind spots in all kinds of ways because we don't think that that path is on the table. And then what about being the bigger person? I think it's okay to realize that that could ever happen. Maybe we sometimes tolerate something to certain degrees, um, that someone else might not, but we are in a position where we can do that. And maybe we do believe that it's just to the level where we can just in the moment have some boundaries with the person, and we think it is still healthy for them to have the interaction with us. Really, the honesty there is the key, right? Like, are we really being honest with ourselves about what's going on? Are we actually setting boundaries to some extent, at least smaller boundaries? So really, like, being clear with ourselves and honest and like really intentional, I guess, about doing that is important, because it is true that's right. I mean, if you think of people, some people have professions, right, where they deal with difficult people. Doesn't mean it's always easy. They might get some burnout from that, but I think to some level we can do that sometimes, where we are like sort of the bigger person, quote unquote, is how the people say it. But I think it's important not to take that on as like a martyrdom kind of thing, but more like just if we know we're really solid, and it's in this more minor way, really trying to be honest though and assess it. Is it really okay? Are we really still having boundaries? Smaller boundaries if we need them is all really important to do. But I did want to bring that in because I think that it's important not to take this as such a black or white issue. And then finally, I think it's also important to keep open to changing. So I think it can ever happen that someone perhaps comes back around and, for example, and they, have changed. So again, it's really the honesty that's the important thing there. But I think, if we're being fully honest and we're not just doing the cutoff like it's completely done. And again, I mean, I'm not talking about like abusive relationships here, or like things where someone's been traumatized. It's a little different in those cases because it just is. But the point is, let's say it was more just a relationship and it was kind of going awry, like with a friend or something like that. And it does seem like something has changed with them. I think it can be okay. It can be okay to consider, like, if we're being honest with ourselves about whether that feels right for us, to try it again and again. So really, I guess what I'm trying to say here is it's okay to have more of a like timeline for most relationships at which we can keep assessing, right? Because if we're being fully honest with ourselves and really connecting with ourselves most deeply, why not? We don't have to go based exactly on our past decision either. We can moment to moment, day to day, be assessing what we really want and what's right for us and for the relationship. And that can mean a disconnected relationship or a relationship that is ongoing. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully it was clear. I like to get into the nuances of things and the complexities as much as I can, because I think that can be really helpful in how things, play out in real life for us all. But let me know if you have any further questions about it or any comments. I'd love to hear them. Thanks for watching.